Hello, and welcome to the course. I'm Stephen, your host for today, and I'm speaking with Professor Amir Jina, an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy. An environmental and developmental economist, he received his PhD in sustainable development and MA in climate and society from Columbia University, and received his BA in mathematics and theoretical physics from Trinity College, Dublin. Before joining the University of Chicago, Professor Jina was a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a founding member of the Climate Impact Lab and has worked with the Red Cross Red Crescent in South Asia. He's here to talk with us about his career path and how he became a University of Chicago professor. Welcome to the course, Professor Jina. Thank you so much for joining us on the course. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Well, yeah, we got a lot to get into. We want to get into your sort of backstory, as it were. But first of all, can you just tell us, what your position is at U Chicago? And, broadly speaking, can you tell us a little bit about your field of study and your research?
Of course. So I'm an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy. And broadly speaking, I do research on climate change or the impacts of the environment on the way human beings can thrive and survive and live their lives. My training comes from both earth science and economics. So I do research that's kind of at the intersection of those two things, thinking about the earth system and the way in which it might help us or hinder us.
All right. Yeah, that's a really fascinating combination of things. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about how you arrived at that intersection. First, though, just to sort of lay out your trajectory here, could you please just give us an overview of the path that you took starting in college and ending where you are now? What was your journey like? What institutions did you go through? What degrees did you get? And how did your interest evolve?
So if it's okay, I'll start a couple of years before college.
Sure,
So
sure.
I'm from Ireland, and in Ireland, like a lot of the Irish UK system of university, you really choose what your major is going to be in college years before you go to university. So I had kind of specialized in sciences. And when I went to university, then I started doing theoretical physics and maths. And so I was really on that track from age 16 and all the way through college. I was then learning only physics and only maths.
Mm.
And there was lots of other things that I was interested in, but because of the way that system kind of doesn't allow you to get the broader view of or to explore different majors or options for majors, I wasn't really able to explore those things. So I was going through college. I had a rough time for various reasons. Most of them non-academic. There was some illness problems and some family health problems, and I think I became somewhat fed up with academia or this idea that my place in the world could be sitting, writing on a blackboard and trying to solve equations. And I wanted to do something else. And so and I did that in Ireland. I was in Trinity College, Dublin. So after I graduated, I moved to Japan on a program called the JET program, where I became a high school English teacher for 2 years. And really, there it was one was trying to explore teaching, it was to trying to travel around the world, it was to just have some time to think about what I really wanted to do. Also, knowing that one of those things that I wanted to do that I really enjoyed was teaching, and another one was traveling. So I got to do both of those things for a couple of years. And while I was there, I realized that I'd had this kind of strength coming from my background of understanding physics. And I was thinking, well, how useful is, the theoretical physics to the people around the world?
Mhm.
Um, Maybe not super useful, even though it's incredibly interesting. And of course, in the abstract sense, it's phenomenally useful. But in terms of the day to day, would my research or my work really affect the life of somebody who I can see when I walk out on the street? And the answer that I came to was probably not, at
Mhm.
least not in the near term. So what could I do that was different? And I started to think a lot more about one applied aspect of physics, which was climate science. This was something where I was really interested when I was younger. I would do environmental campaigning. I used to go around and get petitions signed for Greenpeace and other things. So I was really interested in the environment and was very interested in human rights and in migration. And because I'm biracial growing up in Ireland and I experienced a lot of racism growing up, I was also very interested in the issue of migration and displacement and just people's sense of identity in the places that they found themselves. So a lot of interest in human rights. And I thought, well, maybe is climate change the thing that can unite all of those?
Mm.
And what really made me focus that attention was I was in a town in Japan that one year got hit in the summer by four typhoons. And I was able to be, the eye of the typhoon came over in one of those. The river level was extremely high, higher than the roof of our house, but there was flood protections there and everything. And I was able to stand and to sit in my very safe, relatively safe little house in Japan and look at this and just marvel at the spectacle of nature, how
Wow.
incredible this was, that I could just sit there and watch this huge amount of energy that the earth was throwing at us just passing overhead,
Mhm.
knowing that I was safe. And a little bit later, a few months later, I was traveling in Vietnam that had gotten some typhoons earlier in the months before, and noticing as we were traveling in a relatively small place along the Mekong Delta that there was houses that were just completely wiped out, and that they had been wiped out months before and not rebuilt. And something just went on fire in the back of my head that the earth is throwing the same thing at us, but people are experiencing this very differently.
Mm.
And this was a way for me to, I kind of had a eureka moment that I was able to unite all of these things of, well, this is about how people interact with the world. This is not purely a question of the physics or the climate science or something else. There's something more here that is really unjust across space. Here's two societies facing exactly the same thing to some extent, but really different outcomes. So I went to New York, I went to Columbia University, was rejected from nearly every program that I applied to. So there's a lot of rejection which happens along my path. Started studying climate science, and then there I, not thinking I wanted to do academia, I worked for the Red Cross, Red Crescent for a while in India and Bangladesh, thinking I'm going to study disasters, and this is the perfect way for me to unite climate, people, all of the things I care about. A few things in my mind made me think maybe here's where I speak like an economist, my comparative advantage, the
Mm.
thing that I might be relatively better at is doing the research on these things. And I learned a little bit more about economics, which I thought used to be just finance, money, banks. I had no idea what it was, but I started learning about work by a woman called Esther DeFlo, where they were actually going into really poor areas of the world and trying out different interventions that would improve people's lives and running big experiments on them. And again, this was the other big eureka moment, thinking I can do this. I can do research on what works, what might help people, what might not. So I then joined the PhD program, which was a mixture of economics and climate science at Columbia. So I stayed where I was for a while in New York. And then I did a year working on a big climate risk report for the United States, which then changed the trajectory of my life again. And I ended up moving to University of Chicago as a postdoc and finally as a faculty member where I am now.
Wow. I loved your description of that, just that moment in the storm, and thinking about this raw energy, but also, the role that humans can play, and how we deal with it. That's really interesting. I want to come back to some of those experiences, but I also wanted to ask about even further in the past. I mean, you referenced some of your interests as a kid, being concerned about the climate. What did you think? Maybe as like a middle schooler or high schooler, like what did you think you might go into? And yeah, tell me a little bit.
Well, I was a little bit, I think, all over the place in a good way. I, for a while wanted to be a writer or a photographer. I thought I would be a research physicist. I thought I might even try and join the Irish civil service in the equivalent of the State Department of the United States, so in the diplomatic corps,
Mhm.
something that would be again involve travel and direct interface with people. And I think the settling on the physics was thinking somewhat naively. Well, one, I really enjoyed it. I'm not. That doesn't mean I was necessarily very good at it, and I struggled in college because I wasn't really that good at it. But the something about it, something the beauty of the honorable nature of sitting and just trying to understand the mind of the universe was something that was appealing to me at the time that I had to make that decision.
Mhm.
Um, Thinking the biggest picture possible, but also the most abstract picture. So
Yeah.
it kind of shifted, but I think I would have been happy doing many things. I think when the way we apply for colleges, we apply for different majors and different courses when we're 18 and we do state exams. And I had put down English literature and I had put down physics and I'd put down some other things. So I think, as probably I've realized has happened to me many times, I kind of let the chances that I was able to be exposed to determine the path that I would take. So I've pursued a certain path, but because there's been many options where I would have been interested, all kind of tackling the same problem. I've always been interested in this intersection of human rights and the environment or people's well-being in the environment. I think there was many ways to get at that. So it was never clear to me that I'd end up on this one path. But as long as I'm still thinking about and working on the same problem, I think that's what mostly was interesting to me.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting way of putting it. And one thing that we've been asking everyone is, just like, how did your experiences outside of academia influence your later work, or influence the work that you're doing now? So one thing that I wanted to hear about was, you said that you worked with the Red Cross, Red Crescent, I think. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah, can you tell me, like, I mean, was that very different from being in academia? Has it, did it influence you when you came back to academia? Tell me about that.
I think still stands as probably one of the most influential things for my research. I was at the time thinking I would love to work with this group called the Red Cross Climate Center that kind of does research on the disaster impacts of climate change
Mhm.
or things related to disasters. And while I was there, I managed to do some tours of Bangladesh with the Red Crescent and visit different sites that were being funded for this concept called disaster risk reduction. So this idea that instead of waiting for a disaster to strike and then responding to it, what could you actually supply to a particularly very low income community to make sure that they could cope with those disasters themselves better,
Mhm.
even if not completely, at least a little bit better. And the Red Cross had this idea that was somehow related to adaptation to climate change, but they didn't really know how. And that was partly my job, was to go in and try and make that link very explicit for them.
Mhm.
And so I was traveling around these communities, and I remember, there's a huge number of things there that influenced what I'm now doing. But I'll tell one anecdote, which was I was in a room in a focus group with myself and a translator and a person from the Red Crescent locally, talking to a community that had had benefits from this funded project on disaster risk reduction. And the translator mentioned in this room that somebody had lost their child previously in flooding. And so I asked more questions about that. And I remember just being stunned at how, in translation, the answers, the emotion was kind of lost. But I remember it being presented in a very factual way that last year there had been a large flood in this location. The woman had put her young baby on this raised platform inside the house in order to go out and save their livestock. And so there explicitly this trade-off
Yeah.
between their own health and their own ability to make money in the future. And she had come back in, and the child had rolled off this platform and drowned. And I still to this day remember her face, not only because the story is incredibly tragic and incredibly unfortunate, and that's the kind of thing I would like work towards hopefully not allowing to happen again,
Mhm.
and obviously not just me. I don't think I've got any kind of sense of grandiosity here, but trying to work on a very small piece of that
Sure.
problem. But the other part was, I mentioned in college, there was some family health tragedies. My father passed away quite tragically, and I really struggled. And I remember thinking there was relatively a lot of support that that the state in Ireland provided for me.
Mhm.
For example, I didn't have to drop out of college. If I was in the United States, I would have had to. We wouldn't have had the money to keep me in college
Yeah.
because of all of these things I faced. And so I survived there because of this public support, or because of this safety net that existed. And just thinking about this vast difference, not just in the experiences that people had, but that there was nothing really to catch them when they fell. And I think that, I still think about that very regularly, and it drives me a lot to this day.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, those are really powerful examples. And I don't think people always immediately put that kind of thing in terms of, like, economics, and like the
Mhm.
actual trade-offs being made. But yeah, that's very interesting. Who are some of the people who have supported you? And what have been some of the trials that you faced that you've leaned on that support for?
Far too many people, and it's going to be impossible for me to ever pay
doesn't
them back.
doesn't have to
Um,
be a comprehensive list.
uh, I mean, my family obviously is one of the major ones, even in sometimes in very major ways. Sometimes, I mean, in major ways because they're my family and they did everything for me. But sometimes in very small ways. I remember in New York when I was doing my master's and had no money. My my brother he had done a book review, and he had gotten $250 in US dollars, and he couldn't use it because he was in Ireland. And he was like, "Hey, do you want to take this?" And I remember that being like, oh, the difference between me eating that day and not eating that day, because New York was expensive.
Yeah.
So little things like that, just this sense that there might have been people there to tell me. And so they've been kind of extraordinarily supportive through all of this. But a lot of it, I think, was I was an unusual candidate coming into academia. I was coming from a very different background nationally, different background academically. Because of these challenges I faced in college, my grades were kind of good in some years and very bad in other years. And so it was all a bit iffy. And along that way, particularly in college, there was one professor who really supported me, wrote an incredible letter of reference about the challenges I had faced then, which I think convinced some people like, oh, maybe we should admit him to this master's. But I think partly with that master's in Columbia, there's one woman named Arzu who I think said, oh, it looks like there's might be something here. This person looks like they might be a good fit for this master's program, and maybe they're kind of on the border of getting it, but I'm going to take a chance on this. And I think I've been the beneficiary of a lot of very lucky chances that people have taken on me, and I that's not lost on me. I don't take any of this for granted. And through grad school, there's the same thing. It's some co-authors early on, particularly in kind of earth science kind of things that I didn't understand but wanted to do research on. Some other PhD students, a friend who's now a professor in UCLA, said, "Well, I do this work on air pollution and these big giant climate models, and I'll explain things to you if you need." So this idea that I had this support network that could answer the questions that I needed, the things I didn't understand, has also led to me being quite collaborative in the way I do research.
Yeah, and I know that collaboration and sort of working across disciplines is a big part of this story. I'm curious. I mean, your undergraduate work was in theoretical physics,
hmm
and you had an MA in climate and society. Was there a moment, or could you just sort of tell me about the decision-making process that led you to economics? Like, why was that the right field for you to be in with these interests that you've been describing?
So I think there was two things. One was I kind of went into learning about climate science thinking there's no climate policy. No one's doing anything about climate change. What's missing? It must be that we don't understand the science that well. And I had an incredible, speaking of people who supported me, incredible first professor on climate science whose name was Lisa Goddard, and she just unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago, but was very influential on our whole cohort and multiple cohorts in terms of how she really got us to be meticulously careful about what we would say and what we would think about climate change and climate variability and all these different aspects of the whole problem. And I remember realizing in that class, wait a minute, by and large, we seem to, as a society, understand the consequences of climate change are. Of course, there's still a lot of research to be done and a lot of details that are about what's going to change in different parts of the world. But by and large, the science was clear that this was going to be a bad thing. And then I just thought, but wait, I was arriving at this as a puzzle of why is nothing being done? It must be the science. It turns out it's not the science. So what's next?
Right.
And I thought, well, it must be the policy. So why aren't people caring about this? And then around the time I was thinking of this, I was in an environmental science class and somebody mentioned this paper by this researcher called Esther Duflo that I mentioned before. And this professor his name was Darby Jack. He was it was kind of an economist, but in a public health school. So he was teaching us about public health. But at the same time, he just mentioned in passing this amazing economics paper. And I, in that moment, remember thinking, wait, this is not what I thought economics was. I really thought economics was banking. And that was not
Yeah.
something that I was interested in doing. And then actually, what this paper was about a natural experiment where in South Africa, low income families had gotten a pension refund. And in the case where the grandfather had passed away, this went to the grandmother. And then they looked at the outcomes on the children and found really different outcomes if a woman got that pension refund than if a man got that refund. And the punchline being that things were much better if the grandmother got it. They invested more into the grandkids, whereas the
Yeah.
grandfathers didn't. And I remember thinking, this is incredible. And that's economics. And it's actually this thing about how you make trade-offs under scarcity and different behaviors and other things. This is what I need to know more about. And I didn't quite have the sense of where that would take me. And it took me a while to adjust myself to economics. I still don't think I would never really call myself an economist, but I think a lot of the tools in the analysis are really powerful for policy. And so that's the path that I took. And I remember those two moments very clearly of it's not the science that's the holdup. It must be the economics or it must be the policy. And then realizing economics was the tool that would make me kind of be able to attack the policy head on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very, very interesting distinction to draw and to realize for yourself. So I want to ask about your the work that you do now, and we will get to the positives. But one thing that we've been asking is, is there anything about your job that you wish you could change or sort of just make go away? Like, what is the least fun part of what you do?
um, Oh no, there's probably too many for me to answer. Um, I think, as I said earlier on, I got into this field. Academia kept offering me opportunities to do things that were very directly linked to engaging with policy, engaging with the public, engaging with the real world. And I don't think that that's necessarily normal. And I think that's
Mm,
like a typical outcome for people. And I think that to some extent that's a problem. As I mentioned earlier, the reason that I'm okay with the path that I'm on rather than something else that I wanted to do at other points is because I've mostly been focused not on the end goal of being a professor or anything, but on the end goal of saying, this is a problem that I want to engage with by climate and the environment. And so I'm going to do that whatever way I can. And for now, I think I've been able to, first of all, learn a lot more about it, but also be able to have an influence on trying to come up with some solutions there in a way which I'm pretty happy with. But if I was, you know, doing something else, I could still try and attack that problem. And I think in academia in general, that focus on the reason of why we are here and doing what we're doing often gets lost. There is this emphasis on publishing. As a junior, non-tenured faculty member, every time that I talk to the media or the press or the public or do other talks, there's some raised eyebrows like, oh, well, you're spending time not writing your papers.
mm,
And this might be a problem. And I think that's something that I wish would go away. I wish we could think of academia more as almost like the old agricultural extension services used to be. I mean, I shouldn't say old, they still exist and are still very important in most countries, but this
yeah.
idea that what we, or at least some part of the university, and particularly in policy schools, should be doing is trying to basically act like the engineers of solving societal problems. And we should be engaging much more. And I wish that that was more important and more rewarded. And I think that that's one big thing. The other big thing, and I'm in economics, which is one of the least diverse on any regard
Mm,
academic disciplines just across the board. And that brings with it a lot of challenges. As I mentioned, I grew up biracial. My father was Tanzanian uh, in Ireland, where even having a name that couldn't be translated into Irish made you
mm.
stand out massively as an outsider. Also, being biracial did the same thing. So, this idea of being back in a space which I now feel comfortable navigating, but one that doesn't have the most diversity is it's a bit of a problem, particularly if it is the field which has captured a lot of the ability to say things about policy. And I wish, we were able to get to the new equilibrium where there are positive changes happening. But I wish we could get to this new equilibrium where this discipline, this academic field of people who are to some extent really trying to solve economic and policy problems looks like the population of the world, because currently it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I've heard that echoed by your colleagues, and particularly the point about just wanting to be sort of going out into the world and doing research and talking to people and seeing some of these proposals and things implemented.
Mhm.
I've heard a lot of that. And I did say we would get to the fun parts, and I know this probably isn't a standard normal part of your job, but I have to ask about your appearance on Bangladeshi television. What can you tell me about that?
Well, so I'll try and tie this back into a general lesson as well. But
All right,
the
great.
I was there working, doing some field work in 2012, and someone someone approached a friend of mine and said, well, there's this once a year. It was the biggest television show in Bangladesh. Back in the days when Bangladesh only had one national television show, this was a variety show, and the guy who hosted it, called Hanif Shanket, was just incredibly famous. And now he only did specials once a year, and this was going to be the Eid special, so it's like the biggest family holiday, and everyone would sit around and watch this thing. And one of the most popular sketches in this variety show was a sketch where a bunch of foreigners would act out in Bangla would act out some kind of typical village scene or traditional scene that would happen in rural Bangladesh, with the joke being none of us know anything about what's going on. Most of us didn't even speak the language well enough to understand what our lines were.
Yeah.
And so I kind of jumped at the chance. Some people were reluctant, but I thought this is just amazing. I'll never get a chance to do this kind of thing again. It turns out it has a viewership of something like 80 million people. We rehearsed for multiple days on a big dance number. I had a few lines and some fake mustaches, and we went
Wow.
out into this village and started filming. And it was this just incredible experience just the fun of it, probably, generally speaking. But I got to know a lot of people pretty well from that experience, some of whom are still quite close friends. And then it was funny walking around Dhaka, the capital city, the next day and having a handful of people recognize me in the streets. The funniest part was after it aired, I was going back to New York afterwards, back to where I was doing my PhD. And I remember being so tired after being in Bangladesh for 5 months and a really long day of travel back to New York. And I thought, for the first time ever in my life, I'm going to spend the money that I don't really have as a PhD student to get a taxi up to my apartment rather than sitting on trains for 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And the cab driver was Bangladeshi. And I said, "Oh, what part of the country were you from?" And he started explaining. He was looking at me in the mirror. And I remember then saying, "Oh, well, I was just in Bangladesh." And he locked eyes with me and said, I know you were. Because there's this big black market trade, they download it and they send it to all the expats all over the
Oh
place.
man,
So
yeah.
even he had seen it. So it was pretty funny. And I think the thing which is generally true about that is, this is an opportunity that was to some extent a once in a lifetime thing that came up. It actually turned into beneficial for research because people who I met there, I've worked on papers with and worked on research with, and it's still people who I ask questions about things. So you kind of never know what will come out of that. But generally speaking, in a lot of this academic work, it's a little bit unclear what opportunities are good opportunities.
Yeah.
We're playing a very long game here. We're basically running a marathon for our whole lives of trying to build up enough knowledge and enough sense of what the world is about to be able to say something positive about it.
Mhm.
And I remember, to generalize from that point of it was to say this somewhat unusual chance fell onto my lap. And I think with most things in my research career, it was in trying to say, is this the right thing or is this the wrong thing? But at least I should take it seriously. And I've done that with other academic opportunities. The US climate report that I talked about, it was a similar kind of reasoning of, let me just see where this will take me. And a lot of things after that, post university, when I really thought I had some serious health issues, I might not even get through those years. Everything now seems like a bonus. So why not try to see where those opportunities take me? If they take me out of academia, so be it. But I think that's again in service of this larger goal of, there's a problem that I want to engage with, and I'm going to take every opportunity I can along the way to try and find out what that means.
Yeah, I think there's a really good lesson in there. And I think that also leads nicely to my last question, which is just what is the most fulfilling thing about your work? Like what sort of gets you out of bed or keeps you going about what you're doing right now?
Well, there's two parts. One, I think if I wouldn't be a researcher unless finding out a new fact about something about the world that no one ever knew before was actually if that wasn't intrinsically rewarding for me,
Mhm.
then there's no way you could put up with all of the other stuff and the hard work and the long hours and everything. But there's something just so fascinating about that moment where you get some analysis output on your screen and you say, "Oh, this is a new thing and nobody knows this except me." And then you start trying to think about it and share it with others. And that's pretty fascinating. So that's one aspect, the intrinsic reward. But I think this extrinsic reward of kind of sitting back after a few years now and realizing that there are places where the research has had an impact, however small.
Mm.
Um, I've worked a little bit with kind of public outreach and hearing people say things like, "Oh, I never thought about this problem in that way before," or having people come back after being in one of my classes for a few years before saying, I didn't really think about it at the time, but I've thought about your class nearly every day since. And just realizing that the influence that you can have is far, far greater than just yourself and just anything that you will ever know. There's kind of little knock-on effects of positive influence. And I think hearing about those are incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. Well, great. Thank you so much for coming and sharing all of this. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amir Jina, for your time today. And course takers, if you enjoyed listening to today's interview, please check out the others. You can find out more about the University of Chicago through uchicago.edu or the university's campus in Hong Kong through uchicago.hk. See you around.